So before we get into the presentation, Johnny's right. What this is kind of intended to show is kind of intended to show a little template, and is very simple. Of if you want to give a presentation about your own lodge, this is how simple you can make it. And all it really is going to be going through and showing you what I consider to be the top 10 issues from Nayawin Rar Lodge 296. And I'm going to talk about each one a little bit. You don't have to pick, if you want to do top 10, you could make it a little more spicy, I guess. You could say the top 10 controversial issues from your lodge. You know, that might be an interesting presentation for some of the lodges out there. So, and I do recognize that a lot of this is a little subjective. I've already mentioned, that I'm looking forward to hearing Greg's thought at the end of this, because I have a feeling there will be some disagreement about some of these, because what I've seen as far as in patches from our area over the last 10, 15, 20 years, or however long it's been now, may be very different from what somebody else who's been in the area and what they've had come through their hands. And there are some issues that it's a little bit, well, if you're ranking them in a top 10 order, do you rank them based on how much they sell for? I mean, is that what you're going to rank them on, or do you rank them based on scarcity, or do you try to kind of see some sort of common ground between those two things? Because scarcity and value do not always go hand in hand. But this is just kind of meant to show that, you can have a nice simple presentation, couple minutes each slide, and you should be good to go. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into it. Number 10. So this is the easiest issue of the top 10 issues, I would say, is the 2012 NOAC. This is probably the hardest spot for me, was picking the number 10 spot, which I think you would say, well, that seems a little odd. Of all the spots, that was the hardest. Yeah, it was the hardest for me. And the reason is that you have this issue, which was made in 2012 for the NOAC. There were 50 of them made. We only sent 6 people up there on a contingent. For our lodge, when we normally made a delegate patch at Conclave or something like that, we usually got 2 of them. So we were each given 5 of these patches when we went to NOAC, and we thought we were getting a bunch of patches. The remainder, the leftover 20 of them, there wasn't really a plan for them initially. I think they actually probably would have just been split up and issued among the people who went. But what happened is we went up to NOAC, had NOAC, we came back, and somebody approached the lodge and they wanted to buy 5 of them. And they offered $350 a piece for the 5, for each, of the 5. And that threw up a red flag. And then we're having an LEC meeting and they're saying, well, what are we going to do? And it was like, well, okay, if someone wants to pay us that much money for these leftover flaps, the people who went to NOAC, I was one of them, we were kind of like, we're fine with that. I mean, sell them to, if somebody wants to do that, that's fine. Sell them 1 per person, $350, sell, I think they sold 10 or so of them and threw the rest in the lodge box for future auctions. And all 10 sold out at 1 per person for $350. They sold out. It was treated as a fundraiser. That kind of set a value for these, and they've been very difficult ever since then. I will say it was probably good that I was on the contingent and I got some duplicates from some of the people who went, and I had my extras, and Charlie Amon was there and he was a collector and he had some extras. If it had been some other members of our lodge and these had just gone away and never been seen, which happens to a lot of our stuff, they would be much harder than they are. So there's 2 other issues I'll touch on maybe later that I really struggled about whether or not this should be the one or if they should be the one for this spot. But anyway, that's kind of the history of this patch. Now, number 9 through 7 to me is kind of a 3-way tie. And at one time, I would have been very adamant that it was not a tie at all. And so these issues, you first have what I rank as number 9, which is the R1. So the first issue of the lodge came out in 1945. Most of these can be traced back to boys who went to the 1946 conference. If they went to the 46 conference, they were allowed to buy as many as they wanted to buy, and a lot of boys bought them to trade on the way there. So most of the R1s that you will ever find are mint. And the reason is, those are the ones that got traded away, those survived. If they were put on a shirt and they were washed and they were sewn and everything, they didn't hold up because it's a silk screened on felt patch. So most of the ones you'll find were ones that were traded away going to the 46 conference. The R4, which is compressed lodge, it came out in 1949. And it should be noted that it came out before the R3, but we didn't renumber them. When we kind of learned more information after they had been listed in Blue Book, and we didn't want to renumber them. But the R4 did come out before the R3, and we are very positive of that. We have very clear evidence of that. But anyway, I would say that at one time, the R4 and the R2, both of them, were significantly harder than an R1. And in my opinion, at that time, they would have commanded more of a dollar figure amount than the R1. What has happened is I believe a lot of the R1s were dug by people who looked for people who went to the 46 conference. Those have all dried up. Those have, over time, those have made their way out to collectorate. People collect first issues. Those have kind of dried up. Now you're seeing more R2 and R4s come out than I've ever seen come out in just the last number of years. They're not common by any means. They're still very hard patches. But now I think that they are become easier, and the R1s are maybe a little bit harder. So I think they've kind of evened out to where they're all roughly equal scarcity to get one now for your collection. And I actually think the value of the R2 and the R4 have declined to the point that the R1 is now worth more. So, but the R2 just has that small N, and it came out after the R1s ran out, which they ran out in 46, and so they were issued in 47. And so moving on, you have what I consider the sixth hardest patch from the Lodge, which would be our S1. So the S1 is the first flap. It's designed based on the 1957 6A conference flap, the conclave flap from that year. And the restriction on it is a little weird. It was not, a lot of people talk about, one per life or one per advancement or something like that. It wasn't restricted that way. It was restricted one per year. So it was one per year. However, it came out in the fall of 1958, and the S2, the second issue of the flap-shaped patch from the Lodge, it came out in 1960. So it was issued at the fall of 58, and it was issued in 59, and that was it. There were no more. So most people got one. Some people got two. It really, in general, most Lodge members from that time period would only have one. I will say this is where you get really questionable on rankings and stuff. If we're going by dollar value, this is one of the more valuable items from the Lodge. You can decide in your own presentation if you're using this as a template how much you want to talk about dollar value. Sometimes I talk about it more than others. The last couple of the flap that I've had, I've sold for around $1,500, which to me is a lot. I've seen more of them because it's my area. I will say for every 10 you go through, maybe one will be mint. Maybe. The other 9 will either have been cleaned or they'll be sewn or stained or there'll be condition issues. It is a very hard patch to find in mint. And the reason is because it was only issued for essentially a year and a half. And everybody that got it put it on their uniforms. And it's very, very hard to find in mint. And I would rate a mint one much higher than the average one, which is going to be a sewn one. The next issue, and this is where I am imagining Greg shaking his head going, "What are you thinking, Larry?" Well, I rated the F3A above the S1. This is not because of a dollar figure value. The F3A, in my opinion, is $100 to $150 flap, I think is what the last couple have sold for. So a tenth of the value of an S1. However, it is daggone hard. You just never see these. There's been a little bit of conflicting reports on how these were exactly issued or why they were exactly issued. The F3B is not very difficult. It's fairly common $20 flap. I mean, for our lodge, a fairly common flap. This came out in 1989. There were 200 of them made. They were sold 3 per purchase. So this was the Ordeal flap. There was a Brotherhood individual, and they were all sold 3 per purchase. The F4 and F5 are not that difficult to find. However, what I understand, Brett Warner told me this was his Ordeal flap. And him and his dad both went through their ordeal at the same weekend, and so they had 2 of them, and this was his Ordeal flap. Based on that, what I believe happened is our fall ordeal classes are usually like 100 people, somewhere in there. So I think they set aside an ordeal class amount of these, and those went to the candidates, and they went home, they got sewn on shirts, and they just disappeared, as most ordeal members do. And some of these were bought by regular lodge members and worn. This was the first Ordeal Brotherhood Vigil flap set we ever had, and a lot of them were worn. You even see occasionally, it's not as recent in recent years, but I used to still see old timers show up with a Vigil flap and F5 on their uniform. And so these just disappeared, and you just never see them. I mean, in the time I've been collecting, I think I've seen maybe 4 of them. I think 4, that sounds about right. I've probably seen 40 of the first flap. So that just tells you this is much more scarce. The value of it just doesn't reflect that. Now, the S11, I think most people would agree that this is harder than the S1. This is classically, I would say this is the hardest flap. If we're not looking at weird issues that may or may not be considered lodge issues, and I didn't list any Q's or Y's or Z's. I didn't do any of those as part of this presentation because they're not lodge issues. The S11 was made in 1986. It was 1 for every 40 hours of service. They did a lot of service for the conclave. They built an amphitheater. This story's pretty well known among people who collect the lodge because it's just kind of a famous issue into the state. 77 of them were earned. So that's 40 times 77 hours of service, plus the people who didn't earn up to 40 hours to get a flap. And my understanding is they tracked that really stringently. And if you didn't work 40 hours, you didn't get one. There were some people who worked 80 hours and they got 2. But that was very few individuals. Ed Williford told me, he was there. They counted out the number that had been earned. The rest of them were in a 5-gallon green bucket. They poured lighter fluid in it and they burned them. So 123 were burned because they had ordered 200. And that was approved by the LEC. So it was all done there, which apparently was a big deal. Some people were not happy about it, but the people who earned it didn't feel like people who hadn't worked the hours should get them. And so that's what they did. And so while it doesn't command the value of an S1, once again, this is just a much harder flap than, just in terms of scarcity, it's much harder. I've actually seen fewer F3As than I have S11s. That being said, I really feel like sometimes the F3A kind of goes under the radar and maybe people don't realize quite what they have, or maybe they, I could see a lot more of them coming out of the woodwork than these. These just don't come out of the woodwork. People who earned them know exactly what they have and are very proud of it. So the number 3 hardest lodge issue, this is another one I'm not sure about Greg's opinion on, is the R6. And so I'm rating this higher than I do the R1, than I do the R4, than I do the R2. And it came out in 1988. And you go, well, why in the world is a 1988 patch that difficult? Well, there were 48 made. And you're going to say, no, Larry, you're wrong. Why would they make 48 of something? You don't make patch quantities in 48 or by the dozen. Well, hats are ordered by the dozen. And they made 48 of these because each one came to the lodge sewn on a hat. That's how they came. They were a patch sewn on a hat. There is another version, and I'm not sure if it came before or after. I'm guessing after, that is directly embroidered onto a hat. And I think it's because these came in, and some people bought them to wear them as a hat, and then some collectors bought them and cut the patch off. And I think I think it became an issue at the time, and so they actually ordered another version where they were just directly embroidered on the hat. But these are just incredibly hard. I've had a lot of 296 items over the years. It's my area. I've had 2 of these. Extraordinarily rare patch. Not particularly valuable compared to a lot of the other issues. It's one of the patches that if I saw it on eBay, I'd kind of expect it to bring $150, maybe $200, which is half what some of the other rounds bring. But in terms of scarcity, it's just really, really difficult. And if someone came to me tomorrow and said, I'll pay, whatever the number is, I want one of those, I'd say, well, keep looking. Maybe in 5 years, one will show up and you can buy it. I mean, they're just not there. They were on hats. I don't know how many ended up in collectors' hands. I don't think many extras were bought by collectors. I think that the guys who got them, they bought one, they stuck it in their collection. And a lot of those guys that got this in 1988, they still have it. Or they wore it until the hat wore out and then they threw it in the trash. So this is one thing I will mention. I did not include a patch that I considered for the top 10 spot, the number 10 spot. And it's kind of like this in a way. It's an odd shaped patch. This is a round, but it's an odd shape. And it was our first Conclave early bird patch. They made it not last year, the year before. And they only made 50 of them. And I cannot, in good conscience, consider a patch that's only a couple years old to be on this list. I had a hard time putting the 2012 patch on this list. That patch, maybe one day it will be on this list. I'm just saying that for those who collect, Lodge 296, it's a new patch, but they made very few of them, and they were one per person if you were one of the first 50 people who registered for Conclave. And I just, when I look at that patch, I remember this patch. And it's not a patch that's necessarily has tons and tons and tons of value, but it's just a patch that in the future, it ended up being really, really hard to find. And I just have a feeling that early bird patch may end up being like that. So something to kind of keep in mind. Now, going into neckerchiefs, you see 2 on this page, and you would say, oh, these are different because there's a solid fletching and there's a separated fletching, and one has a gold moon and one has a yellow moon, and there's these little differences. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. These were all hand embroidered in Taiwan, and the issue is that everyone is a little different. When they were done for Blue Book, they consulted one individual's collection for Blue Book. And they said, okay, this is what a 296 collection is. And that became Blue Book. The problem is that he had 2 different ones, which is very impressive. But every one I've ever seen is different. I've seen separated fletchings with the gold moon. I've seen, just different. They're just all different. When I renumbered things, it was listed originally as an N2 and an N3 as the Blue Book numbering, as 2 different issues. I combined them into an A and a B at that time. I said, well, okay, separated and, solid A and B, okay. My only issue with that is that I really feel like they should just be MVE. I don't, I haven't made a change or anything to how they're listed on Patch Vault. They're still listed as an A and a B, but realistically, they should just be MVE. If you have one, you're doing very, very well already. This is a very hard issue. They were issued in 1957. All of our first neckerchiefs were one per life. And if you wanted a new neckerchief, if a new one came out and you wanted a new one as opposed to an old one, you had to turn in your old neckerchief to be able to buy a new one. It was very much you get one and you're expected to wear it to Conclave, you're expected to wear it to NOAC, you know, this is what it is. When these came out, people hated them. They thought this was an ugly neckerchief, which I've always liked them, so I don't really see it. But that's from people at the time. They say when this came out, everyone in the lodge didn't like it. As soon as these ran out, they turned around and made the chain stitch neckerchief, the N3, which is basically just a similar design done with chain stitch. That neckerchief everyone loved, and they issued that neckerchief from 1960 to 68. It's a lot more common. That is the other issue that I really struggled with what should be in the number 10 slot. And I really thought that maybe the chain stitch neckerchief should be in that slot. I struggled with that a bit. I would say the flap I have in the number 10 spot, the S62, I would rather have the flap than a dirty chain stitch, but I would rather have a mint chain stitch neckerchief than the flap. I know that's a little weird, but because these were worn, they were required by the lodge to be worn at these functions, a lot of them are very well used. It's not common to find any of our early neckerchiefs in like immaculate condition. You just don't find them. Quantity wise, I think, and this is it's hard to know for sure, but I think there are less N2 known than our first neckerchief. So that makes it, in a way, our hardest neckerchief. And this is where it's hard to know whether this should be listed here or it should be listed in the number 1 spot. Because the number 1 hardest item to collect from the lodge, in my opinion, is our first neckerchief. There are technically less N2 than N1s that I'm aware of in collections. However, it really depends on what you want to consider the holy grail of the lodge. This is the issue. The N1 is silk screened on this very fine, almost like a high quality linen. People always told me that these were cut out of parachutes. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm a little doubtful. We do have Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and these came out. They were issued from 1953 to 57. They were issued for 4 years, and we're pretty sure on that time period. Because they were required to be worn, and they're an odd material, and the silk screen on that material doesn't hold up well, if you wash these, that silk screen, the first wash, that silk screen's almost gone. It's just, it just completely fades to very translucent, not very nice coloring. So you find these neckerchiefs in 2 conditions. You find them either very, very dirty with a beautiful dark silk screen, or you find them washed and clean with a really bad faded silk screen that you really don't want that one in your collection. That's the 2 ways you find them. You never, ever find a mint one with a dark silk screen, except for the one I have. I got mine from a gentleman who was going to attend the 1953 National Jamboree, and so he that was the only big event he went to, and he really didn't remember a lot about the OA. He just remembered going to the Jamboree. But somehow he bought one of these, folded it, stuck it in a box, and never touched it again until a couple years ago when I bought it from him. And it is the most immaculate example that I have ever seen. you also need to understand that this neckerchief is not like, oh, it's a square, it's, you know, it's kind of big. No, this is huge. This neckerchief is big enough. I know where Rick Pridgeon got his. He went to visit someone, and they were using this as a tablecloth in their patch room at their little scouting area. It was actually being used as a full-size tablecloth. Because and when I went to see Jimmy Eason, who had one, we unfolded it, and it hung over the edges of his kitchen table. This neckerchief is enormous. I believe a good number of these were turned in either to get the into or later to get the chain stitch. I really don't think a lot of people who were issued these kept these and took them home. Or if they did, they ended up washing them. They got to looking so bad, they were eventually discarded. Not a lot of these are known to exist in collections. So when it comes down to the number 1 and number 2 items of the Lodge, I would say, without a doubt, a near mint N1 is the gemstone of a 296 collection. However, if it's a really dirty or faded or just really not nice looking N1, I would probably rather have an N2 if it was a nice mint N2. So there is a little bit of play in this presentation, and if you want to do a presentation like this, you are absolutely welcome to have a little bit of license to, you know, let the listings be a little in flux, or however you want to consider it. The last thing I'll mention is kind of an honorable mention, are the Vigil medallions of the Lodge. These started being made in 2015. This is the MED2, I think is how they're considering MED as the designation for medals or medallions. Really, any of these are very, very difficult. They're 1 per Vigil member. The early ones, they were much more stringent on than the later ones. But basically, especially the early ones, if you weren't there, then you just didn't get one. And some of them were made in lesser quantity. The earlier ones were made in lesser quantities. They make 1 per year. None of them are common. They're not really things that I think people are collecting anyway. I don't think anyone's really collecting these. There's not many collectors in the Lodge to begin with. You know, I have been at every single Vigil, other than one, but Gary helped me out on that one. But anyway, I've been at every other one, so I actually do have a complete set of all of them. One of them, I think I was sick, and I just couldn't make it. Anyway, the point is that these were not really made in, you know, a lot of stuff today is made to be collected and to be traded and to be, you know, these really weren't made for that. These were made as tokens that were given away to Vigils who were there. If people decide that these are going to be something that they collect, well, they're going to be very, very difficult to get. Because even I get one, and unless one randomly comes my way in a collection, there is no way to get another one, with the exception of occasionally they end up put in, if they're trying to raise money to send the kids to NOAC or something, they may pull a couple out of the old ones out of the Lodge box. But other than that happening every couple years, they're just not there. They're just the price is really immaterial. They're really just not there. So that's just kind of an honorable mention that I didn't really think it fell into the other items as how they've been collected and stuff, but that's it. That's the entire presentation. Just a reminder that was about 30 minutes or so. So if you want to do a presentation on your Lodge, just take the picture of the 10 best items you can think of, and you can put it on there and just talk about them for, 1 to 4 minutes, however long you feel like it needs to cover each item. And that's really all a presentation has to be.